Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Stovall. I'm the Chief Investment Strategist at CFRA Research, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar, Healthy Living, a Focus on Healthcare and Building Products. Let's take a look at the participants in this program. Sel Hardy, equity analyst covering healthcare, will be one of our first speakers, followed by Kevin Huang, also a healthcare analyst, and then batting cleanup, Richard Wolf, industrials analyst, who will be talking about building products and indoor living. Let's take a look at the agenda for today. We're going to talk about the investment outlook for the S&P 500, for the markets in general for 2021, and then dive into the two different sectors. Healthcare sector's involvement in the ending of the pandemic, talking about biopharmaceutical, long-term COVID vaccine campaign, as well as diagnostic manufacturers and healthcare distributors. We'll also discuss a little more about the pandemic and how it has affected other healthcare industries. And then you might wonder, gee, well, how does building products fit into this? Well, it's because of the indoor environments that we've been embracing since the middle of March when the lockdown occurred. In the end, we will have time for Q&A, so we will hopefully get to whatever questions you might have. So to kick things off, I will talk about our outlook for 2021. And as we see in the next slide, right now we have overweight recommendations on primarily the cyclical sectors, consumer discretionary, industrials, and materials, but also have an overweight recommendation on healthcare. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, how do we come up with that? Also, how do we come up with the 4080 target for the S&P 500? So a shade below 4100 is our 12-month target for the S&P, which implies a near 10% price appreciation over that 12-month period. But how do we come up with the weighting suggestions while we also have underweights for staples, real estate, and utilities? Let's go to the first slide of explanation. And we see, first off, it's because of earnings growth. When we look to 2021, we are looking at growth in earnings, double-digit growth for almost all sectors except for consumer staples, utilities, and real estate. Looking for the S&P to post increases of 20% with good earnings growth for healthcare added onto the positive performance that we anticipate for 2020. But when we look to industrials, we see that sector likely to go from a near 50% decline in earnings in 2020 to a more than 75% surge in earnings in 2021. What's another reason why we are favoring certain sectors over the others? Let's take a look at the next slide. When we do talk about earnings growth, we have to also put it into context of absolute PE ratios and relative PE ratios. And I actually can think of saying that we are absolutely high, but relatively low. This chart shows the 11 sectors in the S&P 500. What is the current PE ratio on next 12-month or NTM earnings estimates? And you can see every one of them is in pretty high double digits, certainly when compared with their average over the last 20 years. For instance, the S&P 500, trading at 23.8 times forward 12-month earnings versus the 16.7 average, that's a 43% premium to its absolute PE ratio. And we can see that many other sectors are also trading at premiums, with only healthcare actually trading equal to its long-term average. Looking toward the right-hand grouping, we see what is the current relative PE, or the PE of the sector divided by the PE on the market itself. We see that healthcare is at 0.71, whereas it normally trades at a 17% premium to the market. So therefore, its relative PE is at a 39% discount. Indeed, we can actually see that a majority of sectors are trading at discounts on a relative basis, even though their absolute PEs still look quite stretched at this point. Implication, therefore, is that earnings are likely to see a ramp up as the year progresses in order to justify the PE ratios that we currently see in the market. Let's go to the next slide, and that also explains how we come up with sector recommendations. It's basically the count of the stocks within each sector that have favorable, meaning 4 or 5-star recommendations, buy or strong buy recommendations. The two sectors we'll be discussing today, industrials and healthcare, have above average percentage of their constituents with favorable investment recommendations versus the market as a whole, which is at 45%. And then you can see those three sectors with underweight recommendations. Real estate, utility, consumer staples have 35% or fewer of their constituents that are favorably positioned, in our opinion. So let's go into a deep dive. Let's talk more about these sectors. Let's talk to the experts of those sectors to see what they think are the opportunities in the year 2021. So let's go to the next slide, where I then will introduce Sel Hardy and Kevin Huang. Take it away.
Thank you, Sam. I will start with pharmaceuticals on the next slide. By nature, pharmaceuticals are a defensive sub-industry, and independent from economic conditions, demand for essential drugs have remained strong and mostly unaffected by the COVID-19 pandemic, a trend we expect to continue. Our long-term outlook for the sub-industry is positive. We expect a strong and healthy growth in worldwide prescription drug sales. As you can see from the graph on the right-hand side, based on data from Evaluate Pharma, worldwide prescription drug sales are expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 7.4% between 2020-2026 and reach $1.4 trillion by 2026. According to the latest US Census data, the 65-plus age cohort is growing 5 times as fast as the total US population. We think that the trend of aging baby boomers will positively impact the demand for prescription drugs in 2021 and beyond. Before COVID-19, the fastest growing area within pharmaceuticals was oncology. This area will continue to see significant growth in our view due to the rising number of cancer patients worldwide. Between 2020-2026, oncology drug sales are expected to grow at a CAGR of 12% and make up 22% of the total prescription and OTC drugs worldwide in 2026, according to Evaluate Pharma. This is explained by the fact that oncology therapies have been high revenue and margin-generating products, a trend we expect to continue. Moving to my third point, we think the COVID-19 vaccine market is massive and may be expanding in the foreseeable future. We think that the major revenue opportunity for vaccine companies will be in 2021, and if the COVID-19 vaccine were to be repeated, similar to the flu vaccine, every year or every 3 to 5 years, then the opportunity could be large. Following the discovery of COVID-19's new variant in the UK and South Africa, which showed 23 mutations, scientific data suggests that the COVID-19 virus will be evolving, and there will be need to update the vaccine, as the surface protein might not be recognized by the antibodies. To give an example, the flu virus mutates its surface protein every year. Now, let's go to the next slide and take a look at the leading COVID-19 vaccine companies. We can comfortably say that right now, the mRNA-based vaccine developers, Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna, which use a novel technology, are leading the vaccine race with their 2-dose mRNA-based vaccine, which proved to be 95% effective against COVID-19. Pfizer's jointly developed mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccine with the German BioNTech was the first to receive the emergency use authorization in any developed country early December, first in the UK, then in the US, and is now authorized in a number of other developed countries. Shortly after, in mid-December, Moderna's mRNA-based vaccine received the emergency use authorization in the US and other leading developing countries and started to be widely distributed. AstraZeneca's viral vector-based vaccine, which uses a traditional vaccine platform, received the emergency use authorization in the UK at the end of December. The vaccine, jointly developed with Oxford University, proved to be 90% effective in volunteers who received a half dose and a full dose versus 62% for those who received 2 full doses, which is a head scratcher in our view. These results raised more questions than answers, and we think the next regulatory approvals might take longer. Johnson & Johnson, with its viral vector-based COVID-19 vaccine, is expected to be next to seek regulatory approval, sometime during this quarter. Johnson & Johnson is currently in phase 3 clinical trials for its single-dose COVID-19 vaccine, which can be stored at refrigerated temperatures for 3 months, which we think is a critical advantage. And Novavax, which is a Maryland-based US company, currently in phase 3 clinical trials with its promising COVID-19 vaccine candidates. Novavax is developing another investigational vaccine type, which uses a protein nanoparticle technology in combination with a stabilized form of the COVID-19 spike protein. The vaccine candidate is currently in phase 3 clinical trials and is expected to deliver results in early 2021. We think, due to the massive challenge to immunize the global population against COVID-19, the different types of COVID-19 vaccines will be more widely distributed and administered by 2023. Together with the logistical and administrative challenges facing the various COVID-19 vaccines, another critical issue is vaccine hesitancy. In December, polling by the Kaiser Family Foundation showed that 27% of Americans indicated that they would probably or definitely not get the COVID-19 vaccine. However, we think herd immunity is still reachable because the currently approved vaccines have high efficacy. At 95% efficacy and assuming a reproduction number R naught of 3, roughly 70% of the population needs to be immune to achieve herd immunity. Also, a percentage of the population is already immune because of prior infections. Besides the vaccines developed by Western pharmaceutical companies, we also have the state-owned Chinese company, Sinopharm's vaccine, which was conditionally approved in China at the end of December. Clinical data pointed out to an efficacy of 79%, and the vaccine will be given out in China for free. Sinopharm also signed deals with countries in the Middle East, with Brazil and Indonesia to sell the vaccine. Next slide, please.
A key question for investors and analysts is, what will long-term vaccine sales look like? And we think that there could be a wide range of sales outcomes. But regardless of the outcome, we think COVID-19 vaccines will be a very long-lasting tailwind for some companies. Some of the key considerations to think about that will affect long-term vaccine sales include mutations, as Sam pointed out earlier. We think that mutations could render vaccines less effective or ineffective. However, mRNA-based vaccines are well suited to address mutations because it's easy to make changes to both the vaccine and the manufacturing processes for them. In addition, coronaviruses tend to mutate much slower than the flu virus. One of the key considerations we think that's going to affect long-term vaccine sales is length of immunity, which is still a big question mark, and we're not going to probably find out for a couple years. Broadly, scientists currently believe that immunity should hold up for at least a couple years. It's unclear currently what level of antibody and T-cell activity confers immunity, especially since that requirement can vary widely from person to person. A shorter duration immunity would likely mean much higher recurring sales for vaccine makers. And the last thing we think that you should consider is the competitive landscape, which could change drastically over the next few years. We think vaccine pricing is going to increase after the pandemic, so starting around 2023 and beyond. As right now, many companies are pricing at pandemic or non-profit levels. In addition, buyers of COVID-19 vaccines in 2023, once the pandemic is over, are likely going to be much more discerning. Right now, supply is limited, and organizations and groups and people are trying to purchase whatever vaccines they can get their hands on. But in the future, people are going to be focused on the attributes that distinguish COVID-19 vaccines, such as storability, efficacy, safety, and whatnot. Next slide. In this slide, we forecast vaccine demand by region and for the whole world. Our key assumption here is that there's a revaccination period of 5 years. And with the revaccination period of 5 years, we think that we could say, well, that's not going to affect initial sales, but it's going to affect how the sales are in 2023 and beyond. We are anticipating demand of about 50 billion in 2021 and 2022. This assumes an average price of $18, even for vaccines that are given away in China for free. We think this is a pretty reasonable assumption because if 2 billion doses are sold at an average price of $18 in 2021, then worldwide vaccine sales would be $36 billion. However, supply issues could come up. Recently, we've heard J&J say that their production, we've heard rumors reported by the New York Times that J&J's production schedule is off by 2 months. So this could affect how many sales are made in 2021. We expect a steep drop-off in 2023, assuming most wanting people are vaccinated by the end of 2022, because if there's a revaccination period of 5 years, then people won't need to be vaccinated until 2025 or 2026. Overall, we think that COVID vaccines will be a meaningful contributor to long-term sales of leading COVID vaccine developers. Next slide. Here, we look a little more at how vaccination frequency affects vaccine demand. In the chart on the right, we show various outcomes for the market for vaccines based on revaccination period. In blue, we have 3-year, in orange, we have 5-year, and in dark red, we have 10-year. By 2031, we expect to see a $47.5 billion difference in the 3-year revaccination market and the 10-year revaccination market. Even so, the 10-year revaccination market we forecast to be worth $20 billion, which is still huge. And currently, we forecast a significant amount of vaccine hesitancy, and that could change if long-term, because government policies may mandate that people get vaccinations, and that could even increase the size of the market from what we forecast to be. Next slide.
So which pharmaceutical companies are best positioned? We think our top picks, Merck, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Eli Lilly, will continue to perform well through 2021. We have a strong buy on Merck, as we think the stock offers a good entry point at current valuations. There's a favorable patent setup with no key brands losing marketing exclusivity until 2022, and Merck's growth engine, Keytruda, on patent until 2028. We're also encouraged by Merck's 2 promising COVID-19 vaccine candidates and antiviral treatments. We also have a strong buy on Pfizer, as we think the stock is attractively trading. We think the COVID-19 vaccine is the largest near-term catalyst, and the main revenue opportunity will be in 2021, as Pfizer has a large number of agreements with various governments globally. Beyond 2021, if the COVID-19 vaccine were to be repeated every year or every 2 to 3 years, the opportunity could be even greater. Also, following the recent Upjohn spinoff, Pfizer became a more concentrated biopharma play focused on innovation, as it got rid of a declining business. And looking long-term, Pfizer is set to benefit from the strong and healthy increase in worldwide prescription drug sales and key growth area, oncology. Moving to Johnson & Johnson. We have a positive view about Johnson & Johnson's long-term growth prospects. We think the core pharma segment, which represents 60% of total sales, is resilient due to the strong immunology and oncology portfolio. Moreover, Johnson & Johnson has a very solid balance sheet with low debt. Johnson & Johnson has been working on a COVID-19 vaccine, which it expects to have available by the first quarter of 2021, and the company made an agreement with the US government to provide 100 million doses once it is authorized. Last but not least, Eli Lilly. We think Eli Lilly has solid long-term growth prospects thanks to a diversified portfolio of strong brands such as Trulicity and Jardiance, a focus on innovation as seen with new product launches, and a strong balance sheet. In addition, in November, Eli Lilly's monoclonal antibody treatment against mild to moderate COVID-19 cases received the FDA emergency use authorization, which opened a considerable new market opportunity in our view as new COVID-19 cases reach record highs. Next slide, please.
COVID test sales have significantly boosted the revenues of diagnostics firms. With vaccines coming out, many are wondering, are COVID tests going to remain relevant for diagnostics firms in 2021 and beyond? We think yes, but more so in the first half of 2021. We're expecting demand for COVID testing to outpace supply for several reasons in the first half of 2021 and possibly throughout the whole year. For one, it is unknown whether vaccines prevent asymptomatic transmission, so vaccinated people could still be passing on COVID-19. Supply and logistics limitations could affect the pace of vaccination campaigns. We've seen the vaccination campaign both in the US and Europe being rolled out much slower than officials had originally promised. And as a result, there will be greater demand for COVID testing than expected. In addition, regardless of whether there's a pandemic ongoing or not, physicians will still need tests to distinguish between COVID and the flu for treatment purposes. The CDC estimated that the flu resulted in 38 million illnesses in the 2019 to 2020 flu season. If only people with the flu in the US were tested for COVID, there could be a $3.8 billion market for molecular COVID testing based on Medicare's current rate of $100 per test. There are three main types of tests to point out for COVID. The first one being antigen, which is also known as rapid testing. We expect Biden's administration to accelerate the expansion of manufacturing capacity for antigen tests. These tests are very convenient, but less accurate. So more constant use of them will provide better results at the population level. Serological tests have not seen much demand yet because they test for past infection and antibody levels. But by mid-2021, we anticipate heightened demand for these tests because they'll be used to track public health and the performance of approved vaccines. And last but not least is molecular tests, which is the most accurate and widely used type of test so far. But it also takes much more time than antigen tests because it has to be sent to a lab. We expect demand for these tests will remain high throughout the first half of 2021 and possibly through the rest of the year. Next slide. Here on the left, we show a chart of COVID cases in blue and COVID tests in orange. Even in the first two resurgences and afterwards when they fell, COVID cases that is, COVID tests generally either stayed flat or kept trending upwards. That's because COVID supply has not been able to keep up, COVID test supply has not been able to keep up with test demand, as many manufacturers have pointed out. As of the end of December, COVID tests, there were about 2 million COVID tests used on a daily basis in the US, and we think that test demand will peak at 6 million per day by mid-2021, which is 3 times the rate at the end of December. Diagnostics companies are not only benefiting significantly from test sales, but also from heightened demand for pricey diagnostic equipment. These diagnostic equipments, once the pandemic is over, will see less use from COVID, but we expect healthcare providers are going to make good use of them by encouraging patients to get more routine tests. Some of the leading diagnostics firms include Abbott Laboratories, Hologic, and Thermo Fisher Scientific. Next slide.
We think the importance of healthcare distribution has been front and center due to the unprecedented demand for personal protective equipment, PPE, and discussions around the COVID-19 vaccine distribution intensifying. The S&P Composite 1500 Healthcare Distributors Index recorded an eye-catching return of 20% in 2020, and we expect this outperformance to continue in 2021. We believe healthcare distributors will be considerably benefiting this year from large-scale distribution efforts of the COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. With the exception of Pfizer, who is using its own cold supply chain shipping infrastructure, the other major COVID-19 vaccine developers, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Merck, rely on existing large healthcare distributors such as McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health. There are still many unknowns about the length of immunity the COVID-19 vaccine might provide and how long the pandemic will last. If the vaccine is to become one that is administered yearly, the opportunity for healthcare distributors could be even greater in our view. Another positive driver we see for healthcare distributors sub-industry is the increased use of PPE going forward. We think higher standards for hygiene and infection control are becoming the new normal. Until the COVID-19 pandemic is fully controlled globally, we think the unprecedented demand for PPE is here to stay, and the largest healthcare distributors in the US are set to continue to benefit from this trend. However, more importantly, we think the COVID-19 pandemic has created new norms for infection control measures in hospitals, clinics, dental practices, and also in our day-to-day lives. We expect increased demand going forward for certain PPE items such as medical gloves, surgical masks, disposable gowns, and medical shoe covers. Now, let's go to the next slide and look more closely at our top picks among healthcare distributors. We have a strong buy on McKesson Corporation, which is the largest pharmaceutical distributor in the US. McKesson partnered with the Centers for Disease Control to support the Operation Warp Speed, and this is a centralized distributor for the refrigerated and frozen types of the COVID-19 vaccine. This is a large market opportunity in our view. McKesson is also delivering ancillary supplies to administer the COVID-19 vaccine across the US. We also expect AmerisourceBergen, for which we also have a strong buy, to be one of the top beneficiaries from large distribution efforts of COVID-19 therapies as the second largest US healthcare distributor. AmerisourceBergen has cold chain capabilities, and it can use its existing infrastructure to handle the storage and distribution of the COVID-19 therapies. AmerisourceBergen is also overseeing Eli Lilly's monoclonal antibody distribution against COVID-19 in the US, following the emergency use authorization granted in November. Moving to Cardinal Health. Cardinal Health is the third largest pharmaceutical distribution company in the US, and it became a network administrator in the second stage of the Federal Pharmacy Partnership Strategy for COVID-19. This effort will enable faster access to the COVID-19 vaccine for the independent, small, and long-term care pharmacy customers, creating a considerable opportunity for Cardinal Health in our view. Last but not least, Owens Minor. The stock has been the clear champion of the healthcare distributors sub-industry in 2020, up 423%, and one of our best calls for the year. We think the shares continue to offer an attractive risk-reward potential. The outlook continues to improve for Owens Minor as the company is increasingly benefiting from COVID-19 tailwinds. Gross margin expansion continued during the last 6 consecutive quarters, and thanks to its expanded PPE production capacity to meet the extraordinary demand, we expect Owens Minor to continue to increase its PPE sales throughout 2021. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at how the pandemic has affected other healthcare industries. Moving to the next slide, let's understand the impact of rising unemployment on managed healthcare and medical devices. As economic activity took a hit due to COVID-19, we saw a deterioration in the labor markets. Despite signs of improvement, reaching pre-COVID levels of employment will take time. As coronavirus layoffs persist, we expect a further deterioration in the weekly numbers going forward. Action Economics calculates the civilian unemployment rate to average at 8.1% in 2020. We think the progression of labor conditions will dictate the evolution of employer-sponsored and Medicaid coverage going forward. Although all jobless claims do not result in permanent unemployment benefits, the current numbers are causing the termination of a lot of employer-sponsored insurance in our view. Yet, we are seeing a rise in Medicaid enrollments, although with a lag, which would counterbalance this situation. Managed care organizations with high exposure to employer-sponsored coverage in their portfolio will be at a disadvantage, while managed care organizations with high Medicaid coverage will be clear beneficiaries in our view. Now, let's go to the next slide and take a closer look at what has changed for the managed healthcare sub-industry and our outlook. Let's first talk about telehealth, which can be explained as visiting a doctor or healthcare provider via computer versus an in-person visit. Telehealth has been primarily used for dermatology, behavioral health, and basic diagnostics, and its use for a wider set of medical fields is a new phenomenon as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The use of telehealth has been growing rapidly since the onset of the pandemic due to stay-at-home orders and social distancing recommendations. We think this trend is creating a change in the ways patients access healthcare and will continue due to its convenience and the added benefit of obtaining healthcare services at a lower cost. For the 2020-2025 period, the US telehealth market is expected to reach $25 billion market size, according to Ariston Advisory, and grow at a CAGR of 29%. We think the extended use of telehealth will have a significant positive impact for the managed healthcare companies' cost trends. We expect telemedicine tools to help cut down on unnecessary patient and emergency room visits. Moving to our second point, we think the progression of medical loss ratios will also be important to follow. Medical loss ratios, which measure the proportion of premiums to medical claims, tested historical lows in the second quarter of 2020, around 70%, due to delays in elective procedures. This trend resulted in a considerable operating margin expansion in the first half of 2020, which partially continued in the third quarter. However, as care patterns started to normalize and medical utilizations began to pick up in the fourth quarter, we do not expect this trend to continue. In line with our expectations, we saw a rapid bounce back once restrictions started to be relaxed. Elective procedures returned to more normalized levels, and medical costs associated with COVID-19 started to increase due to the rising number of new cases. We think fluctuations in medical loss ratios will continue quarter on quarter until the pandemic is under control. Now, let's go to the next slide and look more closely at our top picks among managed healthcare companies. We think the 6 companies in the slide should perform well through volatility and the pandemic. We continue to see Anthem as an attractive play, thanks to its balanced membership mix of government and commercial businesses. So far, Anthem has been successful at growing Medicaid membership, which more than offset declines in commercial businesses due to increasing losses, a trend we expect to continue. Anthem launched its own pharmacy benefit manager, IngenioRx, in partnership with CVS in the second quarter of 2019. This launch is bringing in significant new revenues and cost savings. Moving to Centene. Centene acquired Medicaid competitor WellCare in January 2020 for approximately $20 billion. The deal made Centene the 4th largest health plan provider in the US and by far the largest Medicaid insurer. We think Centene will produce EPS growth above peer average in years ahead, with its history of value-added acquisitions, strategic cost containment investments, and a favorable environment for Medicaid insurers. Another company we recommend is Cigna. We think the company is very well positioned for long-term growth and is a solid business. We think following the acquisition of the pharmacy benefit manager Express Scripts, significant cost synergies will be achieved. And the acquisition is creating one of the largest providers of pharmacy benefit manager and insurance plans. In September, Cigna launched Evernorth in an effort to group and brand its high-growing health services portfolio, which includes pharmacy services, benefits management, care solutions, and data and analytics. Evernorth, which makes up 73% of total revenues, grew a robust 20% year-on-year in the third quarter, thanks to strong pharmacy script volumes and organic growth customers. Moving to Humana. The company has a big focus on private Medicare plans, which makes up 80% of its revenue. And because of the strong demand for its Medicare Advantage plans, we think the company is well positioned to grow through 2021. Molina. We think Molina is also well positioned because its primary business is Medicaid, and it works with states through contracted managed care plans. Moreover, Molina acquired in April 2020 Magellan Complete Care, a managed care organization operating in 6 states, and in September, Passport Health's certain Medicaid assets. We think these acquisitions will be key growth drivers. Last but not least, United Health. We think United Health is a balanced play with its leading scale in providing a broad range of healthcare products and services. United Health continues to maintain a solid balance sheet with increased liquidity levels, which we deem appropriate given the heightened financial market volatility. Now, let's move to the next slide and look at a different area, companion animal health. We think companion animal health emerged as an unexpected, well-insulated winner during the pandemic. We saw pet ownership and the humanization of pets trend, which I will be explaining shortly, accelerating during the pandemic, and we think the bright outlook for the companion animal health industry is here to stay. As more and more people have been spending time at home during the pandemic due to stay-at-home orders and social distancing recommendations, roughly 11.4 million households became new pet owners in the US as of September 2020, based on American Pet Products Association survey. Moreover, we are increasingly seeing pet owners spending more on human-like treatments for their animal companions, which they see more frequently as a member of their family and want to provide human-like care and products to preserve their health. Based on American Pet Products Association survey, 74% of respondents thought that spending time with their pet helped reduce their stress levels during COVID-19, while 71% of the respondents are spending more time with their pets while social distancing. As pet owners spend more time with their pets during the pandemic, they become more attentive to their pets' health. As we expect more people to continue to work from home, even after the COVID-19 pandemic ends, we believe this trend is here to stay. Our best stock picks for companion animal health are Zoetis and Merck, for which we have strong buy recommendations. These companies are well positioned to absorb the growing demand in animal health in our view, thanks to their diverse portfolio of animal medicines, vaccines, and vitamins. Next slide, please.
Moving on to the medical device industry. The pandemic has certainly brought change to the medtech industry, and there are new trends here that are here to stay. For example, there's been an acceleration in the adoption of remote monitoring and also an acceleration in the shift to outpatient care. Companies will likely focus more and more on developing remote monitoring technologies, and existing products with remote monitoring capabilities outperformed during the pandemic. The shift to outpatient care has been happening for a while, and we think that COVID-19 has accelerated this because there's been a need to keep the outpatients separated from the inpatients where most of the COVID patients are. This will increase price pressure on medtech in the long run because outpatient procedures tend to be reimbursed at significantly lower rates than inpatient procedures. We think that companies that are better established and have a larger presence in outpatient settings will likely outperform peers. There have been some work from home trends that have affected the medical device industry as well. For example, because of the increase in video conferencing, Zoom, there's been a more focus on people's teeth. And as a result, clear aligners have seen significantly strong demand despite concerns of it falling during the recession. And so Invisalign has done very well, which is owned by Align Technology. And as Sal mentioned earlier, there's also been increased spending on pets. And as a result, IDEXX Laboratories, a pet diagnostics companies, has done very well during the pandemic too. Another trend that's happened is that hospitals have dialed back capital spending plans because of the pandemic's negative impact on profits. This has affected large equipment differently because newer innovative equipment has still seen strong demand, while more established equipment such as sales of Intuitive Surgical's well-known Da Vinci robotic surgery systems have declined precipitously. In Q2 of 2020, shipments of Da Vinci systems were down 35%, and even though elective procedures recovered significantly in Q3, the shipments of Da Vinci systems were still down 29%, as we show in the chart on the right. Next slide. Another area that we want to point out is diagnostics, which we talked a little about earlier. In the chart on the left, we show in blue medtech companies with diagnostic exposure and their operating margin, and in orange we show medtech companies without diagnostics exposure. And it's clear that medtech companies with diagnostics exposure have benefited significantly. Their operating margins, we expect them to jump significantly in 2020 and to continue increasing in 2021 due to continued sales of COVID-19 tests. Whereas the companies without diagnostic exposures, in other words, companies more likely to have significant elective procedure exposure, saw a significant decline in operating margins and sales in 2020. But we expect it to bounce back in 2021 as elective procedure volumes recover. One thing that's happened because of delayed procedures is that a lot of people have also delayed diagnostic exams, such as colonoscopies, and these exams have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. This will likely result in a buildup of patients with more advanced disease than normal, and we're likely to see this play out over the next few years. And last but not least, unemployment remains high by historic standards, as Sel pointed out earlier. This will likely pressure the profits and sales of medical device companies as people move to unemployment or Medicaid, which pays lower reimbursement rates for procedures than most employer plans. Next slide. Here we highlight some of our favorite ideas in medical devices. For COVID-related ideas, we have Abbott Laboratories, which is a buy-rated company. It's a diversified medtech dividend aristocrat with exposure to COVID-19 diagnostics and the rapidly expanding diabetes market. Abbott Laboratories is known for its Binax Now test, a 15-minute antigen test, the first one to be approved by the FDA that doesn't require any instrument. And it's also been approved for home use without an instrument. And we think that this test is a game changer. We also like Hologic, another diagnostic company, which we have a buy rating on. It's got a 36% sales concentration in diagnostics, and they shipped a record number of diagnostic machines in their fiscal 2020, which ends in September. We think they're going to have an amazing year in fiscal 21 as well. For non-COVID-19 ideas, we like Medtronic, which we have a strong buy rating on. This is a diversified medtech dividend aristocrat like Abbott, and we think it's well positioned to capture market share, and it seems like it has so far, based on the company's commentary in Q2 and Q3. We also have high expectations of Medtronic's robotic-assisted surgery platform, a key future growth driver, which could see European regulatory approval by mid-2021 and US approval later. And finally, we like Boston Scientific, which we have a buy rating on. Yes, Boston Scientific has had some mishaps with its transcatheter aortic valve replacement program, but we still believe it can grow above peers in 2021 and 2022, especially as elective procedures recover. The company is heavily tied to elective procedures, more so than most of its peers. And the stock trades quite cheaply relative to peers. And meanwhile, the company has a promising portfolio of new products to treat many urgent medical conditions, and we think that's going to drive acceleration of growth. Next slide.
Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Wolf. I cover building products, which is one of the smaller sub-industries within the industrial sector. On the next slide, we can do a quick overview of the sub-industry and our outlook. So what exactly are building products? The companies within the sub-industry manufacture the materials you would find in your home or in non-residential buildings. So roofing, ceilings, insulation, HVAC, faucets, fixtures, you name it. So as you can see from the graph on the right, the market cap for the sub-industry increased significantly in 2020, over 70% to be more precise. A lot of the growth in market cap can be attributed to the addition of Trane and Carrier into the sub-industry. However, it's also worth mentioning that some building products companies saw benefits from new normal trends, which I think is a good place to start on the next slide. So when we say new normal, one of the ways to define this is the acceleration of trends that existed prior to the pandemic. So as we can see from the chart on the right, work from home was steadily increasing until the onset of the pandemic, which resulted in government mandated shelter-in-place orders, and then more people were forced to work from home more. So we estimate roughly 25% of the employed workforce have been working remote full-time. And when we include those who have more flexible work schedules, that number is actually closer to 35% or 40%. So one of the reasons 2021 will be so pivotal is that we will see what direction work schedules will take. So even with vaccines being rolled out, we believe flexible work arrangements are the future, a hybrid model of some kind, including staggered schedules, hoteling, which is hot desking, work from home, work from anywhere, decentralized offices, and similar trends. So that is our base case outlook, where full-time remote is transferred to a more of a flexible work arrangement. And one of the other key trends is housing turnover. Like many markets, residential real estate took a hit in the spring months of 2020, which then drove pent-up demand in the summer and fall. In the near and medium term, we think the ability to work from home will change some of the demand structure in the housing market. So this includes valuing space over shorter commute times. This, coupled with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage of 2.65%, according to Freddie Mac, will keep the trend going in 2021 in our view. So let's talk about why this matters on the next slide. So overall, we think the repair and remodeling outlook is favorable. We finished the last slide talking about the housing market, and one of the key drivers for the repair and remodeling market is housing turnover, as sellers undergo projects to increase the value of their homes, and then buyers adjust their new homes to meet their preferences. So popular examples include bathroom and kitchen remodeling, interior and exterior painting, and deck or patio additions. Additionally, the work from home trends are a strong indicator for repair and remodeling. in our view. So survey results from the Home Improvement Research Institute throughout 2020, which are reflected on the right side of the slide, indicate that more time at home and having more spare time are the clear driving factors behind consumers starting do-it-yourself projects. One last thing to note here is that do-it-yourself spending as a percentage of total home improvement spending has decreased over the last several years, and a lot of this can be attributed to aging homeowners. So it's worth noting that millennials are in the home buying years, and that accelerating trends in home buying will most likely consist of this generation. So we believe that this will help with the do-it-yourself trends as well. So this leads to our best picks on the next slide. So we have Fortune Brands and Moscow, both of which we have buy ratings on. Fortune Brands has exposure across repair and remodeling, so plumbing and home security and decking and cabinets. And our price target is currently $100 a share. Moscow has more of exposure to decorative architecture, so painting, for example. And Moscow owns a popular brand that's generally sold out of Home Depot, Behr. And we note that painting has been one of the hot trends amid the stay-at-home orders during the pandemic. Moscow also has exposure to plumbing as well, and our price target is currently $66 a share. Now, one of the key things we'll mention here is that both of these stocks reacted quite negatively to headlines pertaining to positive vaccine development. And we really believe this is unwarranted given our view that work-from-home trends are going to outlast the pandemic. And some key risks in this area include consumer confidence if the pandemic has a longer than anticipated impact on the labor market. And then another is the tough comps at the back end of 2021, given the solid performance of these stocks. And to close out this slide, we value both companies using an EV to EBITDA multiple of 13.5 times 2021 EBITDA estimates. The building products sub-industry index averages roughly 13.6. So it's quite in line. But when we look at other companies that benefited from the stay-at-home trend, like Trex and AZEK, both are in residential decking, both of those are trading at roughly 25 to 30 times EBITDA. So, we make the case that Fortune Brands and Moscow are relatively discounted to other stay-at-home winners. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to indoor air quality. Next slide. So one of the other ways to view the new normal is the increased awareness of things that were taken for granted before the pandemic. So in this case, that thing is indoor air quality, which refers to the quality of air in a home, school, office, or other building environment. So given that Americans spend 90% of their time indoors, negative impacts to indoor air quality, which generally pose a risk to long-term health, being respiratory and heart issues, should be taken seriously. So in terms of COVID-19, while 6 feet social distancing has appeared to be the rule of thumb, the CDC notes that airborne transmission of the disease can affect people more than 6 feet away under certain circumstances, so enclosed spaces, prolonged exposure, and inadequate ventilation, which allows for the buildup of suspended small respiratory droplets. So how big is the market for indoor air quality? Our view is that it is too early to quantify, but some companies have estimated roughly $10 billion using incremental sales that are generally exposed to indoor air quality. Overall, we look at this from an absolute perspective, with over 5.6 million commercial buildings in the U.S. averaging roughly 15,000 square foot a building. We think the top investments in this market will be HVAC retrofits and services, controls and technologies, and office retrofits. So we can go ahead and start with HVAC on the next slide. So when you have impacted air, there are really two things you can do. You can dilute with more outside air or clean from the inside. So if too little outdoor air enters indoors, pollutants can accumulate to levels that can pose health and comfort problems. A key approach to lowering the concentrations, as we already mentioned, of these indoor air pollutants or contaminants, which include viruses, is to increase the amount of outside air that comes inside, which would then dilute those concentrations. So in this case, we're talking about mechanical ventilation, which is the flow of outdoor air into a building using fans and ductwork in a building's HVAC system. So how does increased ventilation impact the HVAC market? Well, maintaining a desired ventilation rate would depend on whether or not the HVAC components are designed to perform in such a manner. So including fans, air handling units, and duct sizes. So we consider these to be some of the bigger ticket items if buildings need to replace, retrofit, or add to their current systems. But taking into account that increasing ventilation could have a steep impact to the energy bill, Some of the more energy efficient methods to improve air quality is to increase filtration. However, we also note that high rated filters, while capturing smaller particles, can add resistance to airflow, which then could add problems elsewhere in the HVAC system if not properly retrofitted for, like increasing pressure in the duct system, reducing airflow and decreasing comfort, or stressing the system, which then could lead to eventual repair spending. And lastly, we'll talk about ultraviolet lights, which can be used to clean coils to prevent bacteria from growing, or applied within the ductwork to help purify the air. And we think it's important to recognize that HVAC has historically been viewed primarily as a control for temperature, so it's not unique to have a thermostat to help adjust for thermal comfort, but we believe the focus will shift to air quality. I think that's a good segue into the next slide. So for controls, we think a lot of the investments will include controls that measure carbon dioxide to tackle occupation density, contaminants and volatile compounds. We also note that increased outdoor air could have implications on indoor air quality in terms of humidity and outdoor air particles that could be harmful. So we expect investments in controls that account for these factors as well. We also believe safety products and touchless technologies are a wave of investments that will also be accelerated because of COVID-19. So for companies within building products, we're referring to mobile-enabled access and locks, contract tracing, thermal imaging detection and scanning, whether it's for buildings or at border points like airports and seaports, especially as a preventative measure going forward. And then in terms of office retrofits, while there may be some very near-term opportunities, including partitions and dividers, we think this will be more of a long-term transition. We believe office retrofits will be more impacted by the future of work, which we discussed earlier, where office buildings will invest in more into the infrastructure to make up for some of the collaboration gaps. So let's go ahead and move on to our best picks in the next slide. So our best picks for indoor air quality awareness include Carrier, Johnson Controls, and Trane, all three of which we have a buy rating on, and all three of those companies have a good amount of exposure to commercial HVAC, which we think will see revenue growth from retrofit spending. Carrier, we have a $48 price target, and as we know, Carrier spun out from Raytheon last year and performed pretty well throughout 2020, and we think there's more room to run. We know that Carrier has a 3-year run rate of $700 million in cost savings plan through supply chain consolidation. And we think a lot of this will flow to growth initiatives like digital and research and development, as well as help with margin expansion and free cash flow generation. At Johnson Controls, we have a price target of $60. And we think Johnson Controls is more of a holistic investment in secular trends in healthy and smart buildings. And we think the firm's comprehensive portfolio of building solutions, including its digital transformation platform, OpenBlue, will help the firm grow its service offerings and increase its service attachment rate, which are generally higher margin. And then for Trane, we have a price target of $165. Trane completed its reorganization in March 2020 that resulted in the separation of its industrial segment. So now it's a pure play HVAC company with exposure to transport refrigeration. Trane displayed strong productivity throughout 2020 by reduced stranded costs and favorable price-cost mix. And we believe Trane, as well as Carrier and Johnson Controls, will benefit from a potential infrastructure bill that has a focus on energy initiatives, given that these would also drive HVAC retrofits. And we view Trane leading these efforts with its energy-efficient portfolio of products. So at this time, I would like to pass it back over to Sam for Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you, Sel, Kevin, and Richard for your input. And we're going to do Q&A, but also I want to discuss, let's move to the next slide so we can tell people about things that are coming up. We are going to be having, learn more about the building products area through a recently introduced industry survey. So please go to advisor.marketscope.com for more information. We're also having another webinar coming up, the new normal hedging uncertainty for all of 2021, in which Todd Rosenbluth will be discussing ETFs and mutual funds, and Graham Day will be discussing defined outcome ETFs. So another webinar, an updated survey that you might want to take advantage of. So Richard, since you went last, why don't we have you then go first in terms of the first question? you had mentioned to me earlier about HVAC and that some of the key risks for your stay-at-home stocks, besides tough comps, are there any risks that you would call out for some of the indoor air quality stocks?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think, one of the obvious risks is that indoor air quality investments don't materialize due to optimism surrounding the vaccine, or employers and building managers taking other measures to make people feel safe in the office. But I don't think that's the case. There's still a lot of uncertainty pertaining to variants of the virus and the vaccine's effectiveness in this area, as well as whether or not COVID-19 will become a seasonal trend. And another key risk is that there's a dichotomy between some of the solutions to improve indoor air quality and maintaining energy efficiency, where increasing ventilation or putting too much strain on the HVAC system by applying a filter that's not optimal for the HVAC will make running the system more costly from an energy perspective. But as I was mentioning, with Johnson Controls, I think this will actually open the door for investments in sustainability and some of the holistic digital investments that will help optimize air recirculation and energy efficiency together.
Sounds good. Thank you. Sel, you had mentioned about the vaccine companies that have buy ratings, et cetera. Could you explain why Pfizer is underperforming despite the positive news of its COVID-19 vaccine? Granted, it has to keep it under incredibly cold conditions, yet the vaccine proved to have very high efficacy rate, and it was the first one to be authorized. So I wonder, is it simply that there's no more good news left and so people are taking their profits? What's the reasoning?
Thank you. That's a good question. So Pfizer has actually solid near and long-term growth prospects and is a very well-managed company. But we think the company has been mainly trading on news flow related to the COVID-19 vaccine in the last month. And as you may know, there has been some issues regarding the logistics of the vaccine, and the rollout has not moved as fast as initially planned. There are also cases where vaccine recipients developed allergic reactions, which is causing concerns leading to the sell-off in our view. And also competition came very fast. Moderna's vaccine received the emergency use authorization very shortly after, and its refrigeration requirements are less complex. Several countries also recently approved AstraZeneca's vaccine, as I mentioned earlier. But the long-term drivers have not changed. We think Pfizer is still set to benefit from the strong and healthy increase in worldwide prescription drug sales. And despite disruptions due to COVID-19, we think oncology will continue to be a key growth area, which is a particular focus for Pfizer.
Okay. A follow-up question that actually came in from a listener to the webinar is that they have heard from pharma industry sources that COVID-19 has disrupted many drug development projects, especially those in clinical trials. Is this factored into our expectations?
Yeah, I can take this question too. It is true that the main focus has been on developing COVID-19 related therapies and vaccines. So everything else was less focused, but big pharma companies continue to focus on their major R&D for oncology and immunology, which are key areas. So we haven't seen a major halt, but there has been some exceptions. For example, Eli Lilly had a big R&D expense last quarter due to very large expenses related to COVID-19 treatment, the antibody treatment development. But we think now that we have the first vaccines and the treatments, the focus will shift again.
All right, good. And Kevin, so you don't think that you're off the hook, I got a couple of questions for you. You mentioned earlier about colonoscopies possibly being delayed, et cetera. What other elective procedures do you think are going to be delayed? What kind of volumes does that represent? And I guess what kind of an impact could that have on hospitals?
We think that the more elective procedures have tended to be delayed, ones that can be pushed off a little. And we think most of them are going to have come back already. With the recent resurgence, we think that procedure levels were still pretty high at about 90% of pre-pandemic levels, because hospitals seem to be managing much better this resurgence and also getting elective procedures done. And they're also encouraging people to continue to get their procedures. One that we saw decline significantly but has recovered quite rapidly was orthopedics, which we think declined about 80% in April versus 60% for overall medical device procedures. So generally, we think that most of the procedures are going to have already mostly recovered and should get back to pre-pandemic levels pretty soon in this year.
Okay. As Sel had mentioned about her comments with Pfizer and so forth, I guess the question going forward is, which companies do you think will be dominant players in the COVID-19 vaccine market, I guess, beyond those that come to mind already?
I think it's pretty hard to say. Right now, of the ones that are coming out, we think mRNA-based vaccines are probably one of the strongest candidates, because one of the main reasons is they'll be able to address mutations, if any, in the future that come up. And changing an mRNA vaccine is simple as changing a chemical in the chain of the formula and then having the machinery make the new version. Whereas vaccines made through old school methods, traditional methods, require much more effort and much more steps. For example, some of them require that many eggs be incubated, and then the virus is grown within the eggs, and then eventually it becomes a vaccine. Whereas mRNA is much more simpler, doesn't involve a cell process. So we think mRNA vaccines are very strong. And another one that Sel mentioned is Johnson & Johnson. Its one-dose vaccine is quite appealing because currently most other vaccines are two-dose. Although one thing I want to point out is that most companies are probably going to aim to make powdered forms of their vaccine, which will be stable at much higher temperatures. So the current vaccine storage temperatures might not be the status quo in the long run.
I guess we can add it to our milk like Bosco or Nestle's Quick. One final question before we sign off for the program. I'll bring this back to Sel. Do you think that Amazon's new pharmacy platform will be a threat to managed care companies and their pharmacy benefit managers?
Thank you for the question. So Amazon Pharmacy is a very new development, and it's a bit uncertain how it will develop at this point. It could be quite disruptive in the long run. We think it will capture some market share from existing players, but it won't happen right away. It might take some time for people to form habits and get used to Amazon Pharmacy. But we think timing of the launch was very appropriate for Amazon for sure. During the pandemic, when people are extensively using the internet and might enjoy the convenience offered by Amazon Pharmacy to order from home, particularly for Prime members who can get free 2-day delivery services, I believe, and some other privileges. Maybe the biggest threat is transparency, as Amazon shows in its platform the copay price for a drug with insurance and the lowest price without insurance. And another thing to consider is right now, Amazon Pharmacy is a purely online platform, but if it were to use the Whole Foods physical network, then it could create some more serious competition very quickly.
Great. All right, Sel. Well, thank you very much for your answer to the final question. Kevin, thank you for your thoughts, and Richard also for your contributions. So I would like to thank everybody for tuning in today. Please go to CFRAresearch.com to learn more about the research offerings that we provide, as well as for those who are not clients already, please sign up for a free trial. Those who are clients, take a look at Richard's newest industry survey. And so we thank you very much, and please stay tuned for future webinars like the one that I mentioned toward the end of this month. So thank you, everybody. Have a productive day.